Now this video was almost a flop.
This is Guapinol, or stinking toe as it's sometimes known.
Yes, I had a picturesque tropical background and was holding a slightly infamous and bizarrely named fruit that sounds a lot less edible than it actually is. Stinking toe. It is a weird fruit and comes from a weird tree. But a few sentences later, the heavens burst forth in a deluge. This was in a rainforest. So the rest of the audio was drowned out by torrential rain on a tin roof. The video was out of focus and blurry, and the fruit itself turned out to be old and dried out and hard and not edible anymore. And in all my time in Costa Rica, I never saw one again, and never even saw the tree itself to show this other tantalizing feature it has. That is just how it goes some days. But this plant was just too fascinating for me to give up at that point. And thanks to the magic of global trade and the internet, we're back in business. So this fruit here, what is so weird about it? Well, on first opening up the pod, you are met with a strange texture. Not juicy, crunchy, goopy, or mealy, or something like that. It is powdery, and not like just crumbly, but actual powder, like a sort of turn to paste in your mouth like a spoonful of wheat flour, sort of powdery. Sweetened, flavored wheat flour, mind you, that smells a bit weird, hence the name stinking toe. It's a little hard to smell right now just because I was burning something earlier for the second half of this video. But yeah, it's definitely got I don't know if toe would be my first thought. It almost smells a little bit like valerian. I don't know how helpful that is. It's got mild bit of valerian, which is a weird, a slightly footy smell. It's kind of a sharp, sweet smell. It reminds me a little bit maybe of like carob or maca, almost a very slightly sweet, smoky sort of smell to it. Yeah, I'm very curious how this will turn out. But that powdery texture actually turns out to be quite helpful because it means this stuff dries pretty well, which is part of why I'm confident that this dried form should be a good representation of what the fruit is like. And this is apparently a pretty nutritious fruit. Appreciable amounts of protein, fat, fiber, and starch, also calcium and iron. Apparently more iron than spinach in it. Some other good nutrients too. So you add these factors up. Fairly large, nutritious fruit, productive, easy to dry, slightly less in a humid rainforest, obviously. But you can see why this was, and still is to some extent, a pretty major food source for some of the indigenous in Costa Rica's rainforests. And also other parts of its range, Central, South America, from the Caribbean all the way down to some of the drier parts of Brazil. And being kind of flour-like also makes it pretty versatile. You can bake it into cakes, put it into porridges, mix it into drinks, smoothies, icing, stuff like that. So lots of uses. I am very curious how that smell will affect the flavor. Taste descriptions I've read range from generic sweet vanilla powder to also including notes of Parmesan cheese and black pepper. That is a very wide range there. I've tried noni fruit, vomit fruit is other name for it, and durian as well. So this seems to be less controversial. Maybe it's just less well known, but yeah, I don't know. We'll see in a bit once that smell dissipates a bit. So if you were looking for these trees in the wild, and say you're not there in the fruiting season, and you forgot your binoculars so you can't see their rather distinctive leaves, if you're watching the forest floor, you might get a clue if you run across some of these. South American copal, little fragrant pebbles. Now, what to call these exactly, the terminology gets a bit confusing, but I'll just use the least ambiguous name I know of, resin. And if you're familiar with some outdoor survival skills in northern latitudes, you might hear that and wonder, okay, resin, would this be comparably useful to, say, pine resin? And in a lot of ways, that is a pretty good parallel. Like pine resin, this stuff is fragrant, flammable, and sticky. The sticky part more before it hardens like this, or if you remelt it. So since long into the past, people have used it in many different ways. Fire starters, glue or sealant, perfume for treating leather, glazing pottery, varnish, which is one of the reasons it's such a big commercial product in Brazil. There's over 35 metric tons of this stuff harvested every year. And it gets used traditionally as medicine quite a bit, along with other parts of the tree, especially the bark for a wide array of conditions. It has many traditional ritual uses as well, making carvings, incense, which kind of ties in with its medicinal use, the smoke often getting used traditionally to treat asthma. Speaking of which, let's try that. The incense part, not the asthma part. Or I tried to get it to smolder earlier and it was kind of finicky. Why don't I just burn it straight? Yeah, let's do that. Let's get this longer piece maybe. And I do have tin foil on my lap in case I need to use it. You can see it catches fire fairly quickly there. Oh yeah. Burning a bit, starting to blacken. Ooh, gets quite a big flame. And it's starting to melt a little bit as well. Oh, dripping off there. Little flaming gobs. Okay. Ooh, there's that intensely piney smell right there. It smells an awful lot like just burning pine resin. Whew. Yeah, burns well. Sticks to the tongs I'm using and everything. Definitely melting. Whew. Okay. Now I better put this out before the smoke detector goes off. I couldn't figure out how to detach it. Okay, there. It smells like Christmas. Boy. This stuff is used as insect repellent. Wrong time of year to test that here. It's winter in Canada where I am. But it at least sounds plausible given why this tree produces resin and produces it in such copious quantities. Resin shows up in a bunch of different plants for a variety of reasons, but few are as prodigious as trees in this group, this genus, Hymenaea. From the leaves of the young plants, to the shells of the fruit, to the trunk, to the roots, cut them open somewhere and you will probably find little pockets of resin, part of a secretory system, it's called. And the tree will quickly start synthesizing more to respond to the wound you just made, ready and eager to respond to threats. Many of these trees being in the humid parts of the tropics, it's a great environment for plants, but also for insects, fungi, microbes, and larger herbivores as well. So when this tree gets stressed, an insect bores a hole, a branch breaks, the tree just hits a growth spurt and cracks. Anything that leaves the tree open to attack, the tree will likely start pumping out patches, nuggets, and even streams of resin. And sometimes you'll even find stalactites of resin several feet long. Now this does a few things. Gums up insects' mouths, seals wounds, contains a bunch of chemicals that could poison fungi, insects, and potentially larger animals as well. And you can actually see different trees of the same species will sometimes have different counterattacks depending on the threats in their local area. The fruit pods, for instance. In Costa Rica, where I got that fruit pod that I was showing right at the start, you can find a fair bit of resin within the fruit's shell. But in Puerto Rico, same species, but the fruit pods have a lot less resin in them. Now, why is this? Well, it's theorized that it's probably because of this guy here, a type of weevil, or several types really. These guys lay their eggs by biting off a piece of the fruit's outer wall and laying their eggs there. Obviously more of a hassle if you bite off a chunk and are met with a sticky toxic ooze or a rock-like barrier, since the resin hardens as the fruit matures, leaving a pretty finicky window for these things to lay their eggs. In Puerto Rico, apparently less of an issue. They don't have these weevils the same way, and the fruit pods produce a lot less resin. But this resin here, I mentioned earlier the names being a bit confusing for it. Well, the worst one. Trying to find this stuff online, how often do you think this showed up in the search results when I searched for it by this name? Anime. Yeah. That accent on the E does not stop it from just finding Japanese animation anime as far as the eye can see. Searching anime resin, no better. But both these words actually come from the same root, meaning brought to life or lively. And lively makes sense for this stuff because when you find it, it is quite often squirming. Not the resin itself, but in an area teeming with insects and often being a direct response to insect attacks, This stuff is like a blitzkrieg of molten flypaper. Once an insect is stuck, very slim chance it's escaping, and many insects even just end up totally drowned in this stuff. A very sticky death, but one that has captured the interests of everyone from ancient peoples up to modern scientists and film producers alike. So if you hadn't guessed from the title of this video, yes, leave this stuff in the ground for a good long while under the right conditions, and this tree, or at least its group, its genus, for the Americas, this is the main source of amber. What I'm holding here, and what I just burned, is basically pre-amber. Nowadays, it's pretty well known that amber is fossilized tree resin. There is still a persistent mistake that it's fossilized sap, seen, for instance, in Jurassic Park. Sap is thin and watery and carries sugar and other nutrients around the tree, kind of like the tree's equivalent of blood, if you will. Resin, on the other hand, is thick and sticky and is usually more for responding to wounds. In the long past, there were a lot of fanciful ideas where amber came from, things such as it being congealed from sunshine, a product of the sea, or the tears of the daughters of Helios, the Greek sun god, crying over their brother's cosmic traffic accident. And some of these associations do actually make sense. The strong association with death, dying, and mourning makes sense when you see that often you find dead insects and other animals entombed and perfectly preserved within them. And that's probably part of why Egyptians used amber to help in mummification as well. The association with water, these often end up in rock layers under the water and then wash up onto shore. But some people did correctly identify these as being from trees. Pliny the Elder, for instance, in his 77 AD smash hit Natural Histories, he goes through a bunch of the different theories current at the time and decides it's probably produced by pine trees and hardened over time by the elements. Now, this tree is definitely not a pine, but for the amber found in Europe, pine would be closer to the truth. The exact species, that's still very much up for debate, and it's tricky when many of your options are extinct, but we know for sure it was coniferous. And at one point, it was assumed that this was true for the amber in the Americas as well, including the famous huge deposits in the Dominican Republic. But after some investigation, scientists started to see some dramatic clues to the contrary. Not all tree resins can turn into amber, but those that do so through a long process of polymerization, a process where smaller molecules, in this case ones known as terpenes, link up to form long chains or polymers. And as they link up through the effects of oxygen, light, heat, and other environmental factors over time, they become harder and harder, often darker in color, and eventually you'll have a rock-like substance that's almost glassy in how it looks and shatters. Interestingly, through that all, it doesn't actually stop being flammable. We don't often think of gemstones as burnable objects, and most of them aren't, but there are a few. And this is one of them. I didn't have the budget to buy a piece of amber to burn myself, but I will link to a video of someone burning them in the description. But it's not just the flammability that stays intact. Because of how that polymerization process works, it turns out it is pretty chemically stable and easy to recognize even after all that time. At least partially. It's clear that it's from within this tree's genus, Hymenaea, but which species exactly within the genus? Unfortunately, that's a bit harder to tell chemically. We see chemical variation in both the living Hymenaea's sap and in amber, so it's unclear how much is because they're different species, how much because of different conditions acting as it's turning into amber, and how much is just variation from one individual tree to another. It is thought that Guapinol, or stinking toe here, does produce enough resin and the right type of resin that it would eventually form amber, but the amber we do have, is it from Guapinol? Well, something else was found. Fortunately, not only have Hymenaea occasionally left insects in their perpetual open casket displays, but sometimes they decided to leave us a self-portrait in the form of fallen leaves and flowers. And just like the insects, these were well-preserved leaves and flowers. Scientists have identified some of the chemical reactions going on here, but the preservation process is still kind of mysterious. How exactly it preserves as efficiently as it does, how it manages to dehydrate things without really shrinking them, quickly stopping bacteria and enzymes from breaking things down in these trapped tissues. It does such a good job that in a lot of cases, even individual cell structures are still intact. So scientists looked at these samples, and at first there were thoughts that these looked more like an African Hymenaea species, which today also produces substantial resin. But eventually they were determined to be several extinct species, especially in the Dominican one dubbed Hymenaea protera. So that was one thing cleared up, but looking at these flowers brings us to another fascinating aspect of these plants. These complete intact flowers were a big find. More common was actually to find a bunch of stamens, the pollen-producing part of the flower, just stuck in amber without any other flower parts. Why would that be? Well, that's interesting because we actually see that today with species like Guapinol. And it's usually because of bats. Bats go out on these floral benders, a night of wild pollination, and you'll find stamens all over the ground afterwards. Stamens are usually a bit more expendable to a flower and not attached quite as well, so easily broken off. So, that leads us to guess these bat-feeding frenzies were probably going on back then when this amber was being pumped out of the tree as resin. And in this vein of observation, we can start to ask the question, this amber produced long ago in a world that no longer is, what can we reconstruct about the world? What can we know? And the answer seems to be at least a few tantalizing details. Some of the things found in these Dominican amber samples were exactly as you'd expect them today, like the stamen heaps. You'll also find semi-familiar little action sequences to today, like little mites riding around on other insects, parasites emerging from their hosts, a pseudoscorpion grabbing on and riding a bark beetle. You can find insects that actually got trapped playing the risky game of trying to use the resin for themselves. Assassin bugs that would stick little resin droplets to their forelegs and use it to grab prey, or bees that used the resin to build their nests and accidentally, sometimes their tombs. And we can learn things indirectly. Aquatic insects like diving beetles tell us these extinct forests were wet. What sort of water bodies would they've had? Well, finding insects from groups that today mainly live or breed in bromeliad water pools tell us there were probably bromeliads there. And some may have been close to the sandy shore because we've also found sandflies. Moths whose caterpillars eat fungi tell us some of the fungi present. Bees with pollen on their legs and sometimes identifiable pollen where we can actually tell which plants they come from. Fig wasps for whom we haven't found their figs, and palm-feeding beetles, so we know there were palms. We found orchid roots, snails, feathers, mosses, and liverworts, and some of them just preserved so beautifully framed in almost like a tiny little golden pond. I'll just look at some of those things. And not suspended in the sense of easy to resume. Attempts have been made to test if pollen taken from amber can be used to pollinate plants today, if it's still viable, without success, and probably for the better. Scientists are wary of the possibility of reanimating bacteria from the amber, leery of the idea of resurrecting something that might infect us or animals alive today, and on the larger side, we all know how Jurassic Park turned out. Considerably less likely, that scenario, though. But we've also found larger creatures like lizards, geckos, and frogs, and in one remarkable Dominican sample, even some carnivore fur was found. Unclear, unfortunately, which carnivore. Jaguars have been suggested, but whether it was a jaguar or something else, it's pretty significant because it's quite likely something that is no longer present on the Dominican Republic's island today. Many of the species found in amber are extinct today, and to the layperson's eye, it may seem less remarkable seeing this extinct ant and thinking, well, neat, but I mean, it looks like most of the ants today, even if scientists say this genus has all died out except one species in Australia. Still an ant. Show me dinosaurs or something. See Burmese amber for that part. But I think with this, the speculation is one of the fun parts. The mystery and the intrigue. What else will we find? How did these ants and beetles and frogs and bees behave? Even today, zooming in, you find so many fascinating and bizarre creatures that at first glance appear pretty predictable and mundane. Yeah, if for whatever reason I ever got banned from learning about plants, I would definitely turn to insects. A crazy little world. But yeah, fun things to speculate about. It's fascinating. Little glimpses, little windows, little tantalizing hints of lost worlds. But I think the smell has actually dispersed enough now, and I'm ready to taste the stinking toe. Not a sentence you hear every day. So let's try this. So this, opening it up, is definitely a, well, you saw earlier, kind of a sawdust texture, it looks like. Yeah, it looks, actually kind of reminds me of when I've harvested male cattail flowers. The name actually comes, Guapinol, is thought to come from the Nahuatl words for flower tree. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird smell. I wonder if it varies a bit from tree to tree, but yeah, a little bit of valerian, that slightly sweet footy odor. And it's just mild valerian. That's all I can think of. Maybe a little bit of potpourri, like my grandma's soap drawer. Okay, well, let's try this. So I don't know how much to take at once. I don't want to cough out a big cloud. Wheat flour is a good comparison for the texture. Kind of turns to a bit of a sludge in the mouth. It is nice though. Okay, it's not like a crazy in your face flavor, but it's got a nice bit of sweetness. It reminds me a little bit of a mild version of like the pixie dust, pixie powder candy, whatever you call that stuff. It's got a bit of tang to it. Slight citrusiness. Yeah, the closest fruit I can think of, what would that be? Reminds me a little bit of lucuma, which I tried in Peru. It's, again, most people watching probably won't have tasted that. Maybe a very slight butterscotchiness to it. But then, yeah, a little bit of tang, like maybe sort of a, not a tangy apple exactly, but but it's nice. It is a weird texture. I imagine it could go quite nicely if you baked it into, say, a cookie. The smell is a little weird, but it doesn't factor into the taste much. It's mostly just there when you're smelling it before you eat it. Oh, I just got a hint of something else. What was it? Jackfruit. Jackfruit. Yeah, okay, it's got a hint of jackfruit to the smell. I just realized. A hint of some of the slightly funkier jackfruits is what that would be. Jackfruit and valerian. That's what this makes me think of. Okay. Yeah, definitely. Jackfruit gets used to flavor juicy fruit gums. So if you can kind of compare that flavor there, and put that in smell form, combine it with a slight footiness, a sweet footiness. I'm probably not selling this to many people. Yeah. Okay. So in summary, jackfruit and valerian, which is again a very slight footiness, but more sweet. I don't know how to explain that exactly. And the flavor, now can I taste the jackfruit thinking on that? Yeah, I could detect that. Okay, yeah. So I think that would be kind of my final description of it. A little bit of something kind of butterscotchy, just a hint. A bit of jackfruit, more of that. And then something more like mangosteen, or sort of like a sweet, tangy apple. Combine those things together, and that's kind of the flavor I'm getting here. And then in a turn to paste in your mouth sort of texture. So that's quite nice, actually. I do like this. I do wish it was a little bit more flavorful, but it is pretty good. It might just be a little bit old, and I'm curious what it'd be like to taste it fresh. So yeah, I would rate this. Okay, in its current form, I would say maybe 6 mangosteens out of 10. But I can easily see if it was a fresher one with a bit more flavor, it could easily be 7 or maybe 8 mangosteens out of 10. That's quite nice. So, okay, yeah, stinking toe. You wouldn't think it from the name, but tastes pretty good. So I guess comment if you've had any unexpectedly tasty food encounters like that before. But anyway, that's all I have for this week. As always, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. And for more bizarre and sometimes tasty plants from around the world, join me next time on Ambling with Sam.